change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we ended with what appeared to be a defeat to Moses, where after he had that first meeting with the Pharaoh, where Moses, who had been the hope of Israel, had been rejected, where now the Hebrew elders, they won't support him any longer. And Moses, he blamed God for the defeat, telling God he didn't want to go anyways. And now he's trying to secure his release from his calling. And then God spoke to Moses, and he did this without rebuking him. And he told Moses who he is and what he was going to do. And then he sends Moses back to the Pharaoh with a command to let his people go. And then we had this break in the narrative, and it's just kind of thrown into the middle of the story. And what this is this is kind of a formal identification of Moses and Aaron. So this is their genealogy, and it's placed right in the middle of the dialogue between God and Moses. And this genealogy, it begins just like any normal genealogy. And it starts with the oldest of Jacob's 12 sons. And you have to remember, Jacob is also called Israel. And so it starts with Reuben. And it goes and it records who Reuben's sons are, because they become the heads of that tribe. And then it goes on to Simeon, because Simeon is Jacob's second son. And so then the record tells us who his sons are. And then the record goes to the third son of Jacob, and it gets to Levi. But then it stops there, and it just kind of camps out there for a while, because this is where the record wanted to go. And it will never go on to any of the other sons of Jacob, because this is what this genealogy is to establish. This is the record to identify this Moses and this Aaron. So you won't make any mistake with some other Moses and some other Aaron. And then we're told that the three main families that descended from Levi are Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. And those descended from these three families, we're going to see later that they're going to be assigned to the different tasks as Levites in their service to God when they establish his tabernacle. And then we learn that Moses and Aaron, that they're descended from Amram, who was a son of Kohath. And then it tells us that Amram, that he married his aunt, Jochebed, who was probably Kohath, his father's youngest daughter. And just because she's Amram's aunt, it doesn't mean that she's older than Amram. But then again, she could have been a cougar. And if she was a cougar, then she would be the first cougar that has ever been mentioned in the Bible. But there were no laws about incest at this time. And so this relationship was totally proper. And we just saw 2 weeks ago about how much integrity that this godly couple really had, and how they acted by faith in God for their son Moses, because they saw that God had a plan for Moses' life. Okay, and so this is the couple that had Aaron and Moses, but then there's another name here in this genealogy that we kind of want to pick up here, and that's Amram's brother, Izhar's son, Korah. And the reason we want to remember that is because in a little while, we're going to find out they're going to cause this big stink and this big rebellion against Moses and his brother. But what we want to see here is that this Korah is actually Moses's and Aaron's cousin. And then the record goes on and it tells us about Aaron's descendants. And that's because Aaron's descendants will become the line of the priests of Israel. And then it stops there. And it doesn't mention Moses' sons. But we do know that he has two sons. But the reason it doesn't mention Moses' sons is because they are not priests, and so they're not mentioned here. Okay, and now we have that narrative, we have that little break, and then we get back to that conversation between God and Moses, where God now commands Moses to go back and speak to the Pharaoh and to tell him everything that God tells him. And Moses, he's not very excited about returning. And he gives the same complaint that he had given before the genealogies, how he's of uncircumcised lips. And what Moses is telling God here is he's just saying, I'm not a good speaker. And it could be that he had a speech impediment, or maybe he's kind of saying, well, I'm a sinner, that I'm like a man of unclean lips. And that's kind of what Isaiah said when he was in God's presence. And then God, he reminds Moses that he will have Aaron as his spokesman, and that Aaron will be doing all the speaking, and you're going to be like God to Pharaoh. And so Moses, he hears from God, and then Aaron, he hears from Moses, and then the Pharaoh, he hears from Aaron. So this is a lot like that game called telephone, except that with this game, the message never changes. And Aaron, he never gets to speak his own message. He only gets to say what he's told. And then God gives Moses another heads up here, that this meeting isn't going to go that well either. And here it says again that God will harden Pharaoh's heart. And a lot of people, again, will say, well, that's not fair. How can God judge Pharaoh where it's God who's the one that's hardening his heart? But there are two words for harden in Hebrew. One means just being stubborn, and the other one means to make firm. And this is the one that's saying that God is going to make Pharaoh's heart firm in what he's already made it hard in. So God is just strengthening Pharaoh in the evil that he's already chosen to commit against Israel. And we talked about that all last week, where God sometimes will allow us to have our way in our choices if we won't obey his word. And then God explains to Moses why he's doing this to Pharaoh and why he wants to lay his hand against Egypt. And it's not just for the Hebrews' sake, but it's also for the Egyptians, because they're going to know that Yahweh, that he is Lord. And so it's not just for Israel that these plagues are going to come against Egypt, but it's for the Egyptians to know that he is God. And these plagues that are going to come against Egypt, they're not just a bunch of random plagues. God, he picks out each one of these plagues as a direct assault on the specific gods that the Egyptians worshiped. And God's going to show how powerless the Egyptian gods are, and that they're not gods at all, and that their worship of these gods are futile. So he's going to start with the worship of Pharaoh as God, who will have absolutely no power to stop or to prevent any of these plagues. And this is because God loves the Egyptian people too, because God is not a respecter of persons. He will actually one day save the Egyptian people. And that salvation that comes to the Egyptians will come through the Jews, because it will come through Jesus Christ, who came through the Jews, who was a Jew. And Jesus didn't just come to save Israel, and he didn't just come to save the Egyptian, but Jesus came to save all the nations of the world. And you're going to see in this story that many of these Egyptians, they will also be leaving Egypt in the Exodus, because they believe in this God of the Hebrews, because we're going to see a large mixed multitude leave with the Jews. And then down when you get to verse 5, it tells us that through this deliverance of Israel, the Egyptians will know that he is the Lord. And just to mention it here, even though we see that the Hebrews, they have spent all these years of hard bondage and slavery in the land of Egypt, they are never allowed to hate the Egyptians. If you read in Deuteronomy 23:7, God tells Moses to write, "You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you are an alien in his land. The children of the third generation born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord." Now, if you compare this to some of the other people, like the people that the Ammonites or the Moabites, and those people are actually relatives to Israel, they can't enter into the Lord's assembly, even past the 10th generation. So God, he does not hate the Egyptians, And then you have this one passage that you find in Isaiah 19, and it's 19:20 through 25, where it has this big passage about Egypt. And it says, "And it will be a sign and for a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, for they will cry to the Lord because of their oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior, a mighty one. He will deliver them. Then the Lord will be known in Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day, and will make a sacrifice and offerings. Yes, they will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. And the Lord will strike Egypt. He will strike it and heal it, and they will return to the Lord, and he will be entreated by them and heal them. In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come to Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria. And the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians, and in that day, Israel will be one of the three with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." All right. So now here, with everything going wrong the first time, Moses now at age 80 and Aaron at age 83, they return to the Pharaoh in this simple obedience to God. And then they go before the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh, he probably can't believe that they're back, thinking, well, how dare you come back after that last visit? But he's probably still amused at these backwoods hick sheep farmers, and he's probably curious to what they're going to do now. And then Pharaoh, just like God said he would, he demands a sign, which is basically asking these guys for their credentials. He's saying, okay, you boys, you say you're from God, so show us what you got. And so Moses tells Aaron to cast down the stick. And Aaron, he throws it down, and it turns into a serpent. Now, this is the fourth time they've done this sign. The first time it was just alone with Moses and God. The second time it was with Aaron on Mount Horeb. And the third time they did it before the elders of Israel. And that's when they all bowed and they all worshiped. But this fourth time, where they do this before the Pharaoh, the word for serpent here is not the same Hebrew word for serpent when Moses threw the rod down in Exodus 4:3. Here, that word used is the word tannin. And the word tannin can mean a great serpent or a dragon or a crocodile. And this word is also used in other places and is described Egypt as a symbol. And that's like in Psalm 74:13, but especially in Ezekiel 29:3. But whatever this word is referring to, many commentators, they think that this serpent is actually the cobra, the same one that's decorating the Pharaoh's headdress. And the cobra was actually one of their gods. And most people, they know that magic was very big in Egypt. And there's very many books that deal with the magic of Egypt, like the Book of the Dead and all those kind of things that you saw in all those scary mummy movies. But all of Egypt, they were all caught up in these dark arts. And so the whole land of Egypt was full of demonic activity. And it's when someone does a wonder or a miracle, all it proves is that there's something supernatural. But it can't prove that it's true, and it can't prove that it's from God. So now Pharaoh, he calls all his wise men and his sorcerers, and they come in and they throw down their rods. And a lot of people will think that it was only two men, Jannes and Jambres, because those two are mentioned by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, 2 Timothy 3:8. But it says wise men. So there had to be at least two of them. And sorcerers is also plural, so there had to be at least two of them. So there had to be at least four men here. But I have a feeling that it was probably a whole room full of men. And, if you saw the movie, there was only two men in the Ten Commandment movie too, and they did call those two Jannes and Jambres. But most of these guys are professional magicians. And so I'm thinking that these guys, they would have had very fancy, very elaborate walking sticks. And so they were probably decorated, where Aaron, all he has is this plain old almond branch. And their sticks turn into serpents too. But then Aaron's serpent, his ate all of theirs for lunch. And so there's only one guy that's actually walking out of the room with his walking stick, and that's Moses. And what that was to show is that God is more powerful than all the demonic forces in Egypt. But Pharaoh, he doesn't get it. And what the magicians actually did there, it was actually real, but it just wasn't of God. It was all demonic. And all this did was to harden Pharaoh's heart more, like the Lord said it would. And having a hard heart isn't like our term having a heavy heart. So this isn't in any way saying that the Pharaoh here, he's sad. It just means that his heart is like a rock, that it's immovable. And in Egyptian thought, just like it is with the Hebrew thought, the heart is like the mind. The heart is what you think with, and it's what you listen with. It's the center of all your mental and emotional activity, including all your volitional activities. And in volitional activities, that means all the acts of your will. And what this basically means is that Pharaoh's mind, it's already made up and it's already unchangeable. And so now we get to these 10 plagues. And the 10 plagues are probably a little bit more organized than you think they would be. And there's a lot of people who will try to give a natural explanation for all these plagues and how they happened, that all of these things were just kind of natural occurrences. And although God did use natural things, all things he used here were found in nature. He used things like blood, frogs, insects, and wind, storms, disease, and darkness. All of these plagues are supernatural. They also were all literal. They were very real, and they are not symbolic of anything else. They all really happened just the way that they're described here. And all of them were foretold, and the timing of them occurring began immediately. And sometimes we'll read this and we can look at those plagues as if they all happened like in about a 10-day period. But these things happened over a time period of about 9 months to a year. And we know this because of the crops and their seasons, and that all these plagues, they ended on the Passover. And the purpose of all these plagues is they're going to answer Pharaoh's original question, which was, who is the Lord that I should obey him? And so here we find there are 10 plagues. And although there are 10 plagues, the first 9 plagues, they're grouped into 3 groups of 3. And then the 10th plague, that's just the grand finale. That's just the big one. And so now each time a plague is announced, they always start with the same command: let my people go that they may serve me. And that's said every time except for that last plague. Okay, so now every time the first plague in every one of these groups of 3 is announced, Moses, he goes out to meet the Pharaoh the very first thing in the morning. And every time that the second plague in the group of 3 is announced, the plague is announced in the palace. But every third plague of each of these groups, it's never announced. It just comes without any warning. It just happens. And then after every plague, we're told the condition of Pharaoh's heart, where every time his heart is always found to be hard. And like I mentioned before, that all these plagues, they're not just random. They're all against specific Egyptian gods. And at this time, Egypt worshiped over 80 different gods. And you find that even many of the Hebrews now, they're also worshiping these same gods too, because we're going to see them bring their little idols of these gods into the wilderness journey with them. And so the Lord tells Moses to go out and to stand at the river and to meet the Pharaoh as he goes out to the water. And that's how the first plague of every one of these groups starts, with Moses meeting Pharaoh first thing in the morning. And so we're going to see this again at the 4th plague, and we're going to see that at the 7th plague. And the first 2 times that he comes and meets him in the morning, they both happen at the river. I'm going to assume that the third one also happened at the river. But Moses, he makes this announcement from God, the same one he makes every time he meets the Pharaoh before he announces a plague. Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And this first plague is a blow against the Egyptian gods of Khnum, which is the guardian of the Nile, and Hapi. Now, Hapi is spelled H-A-P-I. It's not like the 7 dwarf Hapi. This Hapi is considered to be the spirit of the Nile. And then there was the god Osiris, and that's where the Nile was considered to be his bloodstream. And if it was his bloodstream, it's going to turn red just like blood. Because when Aaron struck that rod and he stretches out his hand, all the fresh water, it turned red like blood. And it says all the rivers, the ponds, and even the buckets and pictures of water, they all turned red like blood. And it says that all the fish died, and it said that everything stunk. So that means there's no potable water. You couldn't drink the water. And if you remember, just a couple weeks ago, we studied, well, it's maybe more than a couple weeks, we studied the book of Revelation. And if you remember, one of those 7 bowl judgments was where all the rivers and all the fresh water were turned into blood. And then there was that one voice that cried out from the altar, and it said that it was just to give them blood to drink because they shed the blood of God's servants and his prophets. Well, I'm going to say it was probably just here too, because it's in the same river where the Pharaoh killed all the little baby boys. And that's not even mentioning all the other Hebrews that the Pharaoh murdered. And it's not clear if the water became literal blood, because the word used here is related to the color red. And it's sometimes used to describe something with the appearance of blood that's not literal blood. But the word stank here used, that's the same Hebrew word that the Hebrew elders had accused Moses of making them smell like before the Pharaoh. But here, Moses isn't making any stink. God is making it stink. And so now they have this plague of the blood, and that plague lasted for 7 days. And this plague is also written about in other sources of writing that is not the Bible, from an extra biblical source from that same time period. And it comes in the book of, it's called Ippur, where it said that the Nile was blood and undrinkable. And in that same writing, it also said that many servants left their master. Okay, so although Pharaoh's magicians, they could repeat this miracle in a smaller way, so which all that means is they could find some fresh water that wasn't red and they made it turn red, but they couldn't reverse it. They couldn't take it away. So here, the Nile, which is one of their gods, and Pharaoh, who is also one of their gods, they have no power to stop the real God. And so now 1 week later, Moses is instructed to go back to the Pharaoh, and he has the same message. And he says, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me." And then God adds, he says, "But if you refuse to let them go, I will smite all your territory with frogs." And God's really clear. He tells them that the frogs will be in your food, it'll be in your ovens, it'll be in your beds, and it'll be on your servants. And it happens exactly just the way he says it will. And so somehow all these frogs had survived that week of the blood waters of the rivers and the ponds. And now they go to try to find themselves this new place to live. And now they're making their way up into everybody's home. But now, where everybody walks, they step on a frog. And we've seen a couple frogs around here, and they're little and they're kind of cute. But I don't think that these frogs are little and cute at all. I think they're probably just these really big, repulsive things. But there wasn't anything that they could do about these frogs, because frogs were a protected species in Egypt. So they couldn't kill them. And the reason they were protected is because the frogs were one of their gods. It was their god of fertility.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,